Hello and welcome to yet another interesting conversation. I'm Alex Bolboaca, coming to you from Mozaic Works studios, and today I'm proposing you something special. Usually my guests on this channel are people who have gone through software development, and usually they have gone through many experiences in software development. But today I have a special guest because I was particularly fascinated by his expertise in expertise. This is something that I'd like to discuss more about, in particular in the context of the software craft movement that we'll touch upon. My guest was a trauma surgeon in Southern Africa, a GP in Southwest England, academic at Imperial College in London, and his work in the past few years has been around researching experts from various domains. Welcome, Professor Roger Kneebone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for accepting this and being so open to having this conversation.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm greatly looking forward to our conversation.
So I've been really fascinated by your book on expertise. I've read it in 2 sittings, so it was so interesting that I was able to kind of sit with it and read the stories and never know when the time has passed. And it's very interesting. Can you tell us a bit how you got to researching experts and how you got to writing this book?
Yes, absolutely. So the idea of the book, it's called Expert, Understanding the Path to Mastery, and it was published last year by Penguin Books in the UK. And really the idea is to track the process by which people become expert. I think a lot has been written about expertise, but almost as if it were not exactly disembodied, but as if it were a thing in itself. But what interests me particularly is what are the stages and what are the processes that people go through as they become more and more expert. And my starting point really is that everybody is somewhere on this pathway. And so whatever we're doing, if it's something we're really interested in, whether it's our main work, whatever that might be, or whether it's a different kind of interest, perhaps a sport or a hobby or some kind of other interest, we are somewhere on a path which is I think often described but less often explained. And so in this book I tried really to map out what that process of becoming expert consists of, and I've set out to weave together different perspectives, different ways of thinking about that process. I've spent a lot of time talking to and watching and getting to know a large number of experts in various fields, in science, in medicine, in the visual arts, the performing arts, lots of other areas too, and a number of them have stories that come into this book, 22 of them. And they provide a particular kind of insight into this process. These are people who have become expert and who are often recognized by others in their field and sometimes beyond it as expert. There's also the stuff out there in the wider literature that I think has a bearing on this issue, books and papers that other people have written. And those, I think, help in shaping an idea of this pathway. But there's an element missing there, which is the sort of really the inside story that somebody can only, I think, draw on their own experience. And so to do that, I include in the book, running through it, examples from my own experience, and as Alex said, that has predominantly been in the world of medicine one way or another, in surgery, operative surgery, and then in family medicine, but also in areas outside medicine that I've been interested in and spent time trying to get better at, but haven't necessarily got particularly far. But putting all these things together has given me an experience not only of the stages that I've gone through, but also personal experiences of things that have gone wrong, and of what it not only looked like from the outside, but felt like from the inside to experience some of these things and some of these stages that I've tried also to include in that story, to really to give substance to the idea of a trajectory that can be divided into stages, but where those divisions provide an overall map, but aren't in themselves sufficient to explain the complexities and the subtleties of what goes on. And I'm hoping that anybody reading it will see that pathway as a sort of set of milestones that gives them a structure to put their own experience onto. And it might be people like the people I've described in the book, or it might be people completely different from a field like yours, like the whole area of software and software craft, where I'm hoping that what I've said will resonate in general terms, even though its particulars may be very different.
Yes, and this is what spiked my interest, that there are so many things there about how experts are formed and where I find myself. But also, I know that not many developers go through or are lucky enough to go through those stages, to having a mentor, to learning from somebody else, to being inside the community of practice and so on. But I think it would be useful for our audience, first of all, to introduce just a little bit the model, and then to go through a few things that are particular to software development that might be interesting.
So perhaps should I just outline the model that I've used in the book?
Yes.
So I've framed it around the well-known model, really based on the medieval guild system in Europe, there for centuries now, of three stages where you start off as an apprentice, then you become a journeyman, and finally you become a master. And although these days we don't use those terms in any gendered sense, of journeyman applies equally to men and women, the same to master, I think that this is quite a useful model, because it is in the sort of it's in the public mind, as it were. A lot of people are familiar with this model, which goes something like this: as an apprentice, you start off knowing nothing about an area of work you've committed to join. And so when you start, you are working as an apprentice in somebody else's domain, the domain of a master who's been through these stages and runs a workshop where you join a group of people who are doing the work that you want to learn to do. But to begin with, you have no idea what it's all about. In the old days, you didn't get paid. You just spent years, 7, 8, often longer years, being fed and sheltered, but not much more than that. And in that process, you did what other people told you, and you gradually built up skills. That allowed you to go into the next stage of being a journeyman, where you journeyed across your country. You took those skills that you'd spent a long time working. You might be a leather worker or a shoemaker or a stone carver or a furniture maker, whatever it was. By the time you left and went out journeying across your country as a journeyman, you were beginning to you were taking responsibility then for the work that you did. You were plying your craft. You were earning a living from it. You were making your livelihood from it. You were doing work for other people, and you took responsibility for the quality of that work. But you were essentially working as a solo craftsman. And then the third stage was when you yourself had developed enough skill and knowledge and indeed wisdom to be able to set up your own workshop and to have apprentices of your own. And so the serpent bit its own tail, and you came round again to where you started from, but this time you had apprentices who were who were following the path that you yourself had trodden and were developing those skills themselves. And I think that's an interesting and familiar descriptive model. But as I said earlier, it doesn't really work as an explanatory model because it doesn't tell the inside story of what goes on when somebody goes through that path. It also makes that path seem much simpler and clearer than it actually is. And it doesn't tell you very much about some crucial aspects of that pathway, such as how long it takes. And although you can't be precise, I think, in how long it takes, you can certainly say that it is a process that goes on for many, many years, and that unless you have been in that world for long enough to have experienced and gone through those processes, it's very unlikely that you will have become truly expert. And so in the book, I use those 3 stages as a kind of framework, a kind of skeleton, which I then divide up into subdivisions. We can talk about those in more detail in a minute, but just to give you an overview, in that apprenticeship stage, going back to that, I talk about doing time, about spending a very long time, years and years, often just doing stuff again and again and again because somebody else tells you to do it, without really understanding very often why you're doing it, without seeing the value of it, and certainly without enjoying it, because it's very often repetitive, it's boring at the time, and it often seems to be of little value, and you can't understand why you have to do it in the first place and why somebody else or a machine or something couldn't do it instead. But it turns out later that those years have been invaluable because they've been how you lay down a sort of foundation for the skills that you will rely on for the rest of your career. And in that process, you spend an awful lot of time doing stuff with things, and in that process you become familiar with those things, and they may be the materials that you're working with, and that might be cloth, or it might be stone, or it might be wood, or it might be, in my case, human beings as a clinician. But you also learn to work with the instruments, the tools, the objects that you're using, whether it's hammers or chisels or planes or indeed computers. And also in that process, you learn to work with other people, and you learn to share space with people, and you learn to negotiate how to do that, and how to establish relationships and become, as Alex was saying, part of a community of practice where you occupy a particular position in a group of people. And to make sense of that, you have to have all kinds of experiences, things that go well, maybe perhaps things that don't go well. And as part of that process of doing time in somebody else's workshop, you learn a whole load of stuff without even realizing it. But it's a protected environment. And so your master ensures that you don't do damage. Or if things go wrong, he or she takes the blame, the responsibility. He or she also takes the credit if you do things that go well. But usually you're working with materials that aren't priceless. You're doing things where your potential to inflict serious damage on anything or anyone is limited. And there comes a time then when you are able to go out to the next stage. And that's often marked by passing an exam or a set of exams or some sort of transition that marks that move. And then you become a journeyman. And I think this is a particularly interesting stage because it requires two profound internal shifts that are often not obvious from the outside. And they're to do with where you place your attentional focus. Because I think to begin with, your attentional focus is very much on yourself and the things you're struggling with and the skills you're trying to learn and the techniques you're trying to perfect. And when you get to that stage of having developed them to the stage where you can go out and be independent, you're often quite proud about it, and you want to show people what you've done and show off you want to tell people that you've passed these exams or these stages. But when I was talking to one of the close-up magicians who appears in my book, who really influenced my thinking a lot, he said that in the case of magic, you spend a lot of time, particularly often as a child or a teenager, developing skills, learning how to make coins and things that appear and disappear, or do extraordinary things with cards to do with dexterity and practice. And when you've been doing that for a few years, you're proud of the things you can do. But actually, he said, that really doesn't amount to anything unless it works for somebody else, unless there is an audience, unless there is somebody who believes, even just for an instant, that something that couldn't possibly have happened has happened. And that, he said, is when you have to realize that it's not about you, it's not about the things you can do, it's about them, it's about your audience. And so that shift of where your point of attentional focus is from yourself to other people, I think, is crucial. And it might be your audience if you're a magician or a stand-up comic. It might be a different kind of audience if you're a musician. It might be your patients if you're a medical person, a clinician. It might be your customers or the people who see your work in an exhibition. It could be all sorts of people, but it's somebody beyond yourself. And so you are subordinating yourself to the needs and priorities of other people. But at the same time, as recognizing that it's not about you, it is about you. Because in that stage as a journeyman, you're moving from being a cipher in somebody else's workshop to becoming a craftsman with your own individuality, your uniqueness, your what the jazz musicians call voice, your what makes you you. And I'm sure we'll talk more in the conversation about that, how that plays out in the world of software and software craft. But certainly in my world as a clinician, particularly when I became more experienced and I became a family doctor, I wasn't just a doctor. People would come to me rather than or one of the other 7 doctors in our practice, not so much because of the exams we'd passed or the specialized knowledge we had. They didn't really know about that. They come to us because they either did or did not get on with us particularly as a person, and they felt that we could help them with the problems that they came, and they would come to one of us or another when they had the choice based on who we were as people. So there's a very interesting sort of tension, I think, at that stage. And then the final stage, the mastery stage, it's another shift to, it's not about you, it's about them, but this time the them is not your patients or your customers so much as the people who are coming on behind you in your chosen area of work. And there you have a different kind of responsibility, not only, of course, to have reached a stage of having a lot of knowledge and a lot of skill, which you can pass on, but also having the wisdom to help people make sensible choices and to think carefully about how to apply those skills and how to support other people in making their choices and developing and growing along this path, which I've described so far as fairly straightforward and linear, but actually which is, of course, peppered along the way with things that go wrong and the experiences you have in learning from error and trying to come to terms with the bad things that have happened and the people or things or all sorts of things that have got damaged on the way, and building up resilience and having a whole lot of experiences that by the time you become sort of on the cusp of becoming a master, you have become also very expert at being able to improvise and being able to respond and bring into play all that stuff that you've now got inside you because of the years you've spent going along that path, bringing them into play to make sense and respond to new and unexpected situations and circumstances that you couldn't have predicted, but where that ability to improvise in that highly skilled sense of bringing into play a whole lot of stuff that you've spent a lot of time sort of gathering I think then allows you to do the kind of thing that we see at its best, but also at its worst in how experts in a wider societal sense form part of our bigger community. And we see that a lot, don't we, at the moment, with all the issues around COVID and the advice of various kinds that comes from clinicians and epidemiologists and specialists in science and medicine, alongside the pressures of politics and all the wider issues that we're all of us facing. So that's a sort of outline of what I've been looking at in the book.
Okay.
And there's a lot more that we can go into, but that gives a sort of skeleton, I hope.
Sure. And it's very interesting that looking at this model, I can find myself in every one of the steps. And I particularly enjoy the parts where you are talking about failures of different kinds, because this is something that not many experts recognize publicly, that, I've gone through these challenging times and so on. So this has been quite refreshing to see in a book. But let me start kind of from a core idea, because I've noticed one of the things that you talk about is that medicine is not a science, a craft, or an art, but actually a practice that combines all three. And this relates a lot with how software development, in our case, is struggling to find an identity. Now, software development is relatively new as a field, right? It started, let's say, 1940s, more or less, and it has advanced very, very fast as a domain because it was very needed. And we have this continuous identity struggle. We would like to be a science, but we are not fully a science. It is about design, it is about engineering, but it kind of combines all of them. And now we're also talking about craft, but there is also discussions about something that's more industrialized, in the sense that a craft is something where you build something new all the time, and the objects that you build are different. And this can be extremely useful if you make custom suits or things like that. But then you also have an industrial side where you would like to have kind of a repeated component-based factory where you combine things and so on. So in this history of software development, we've tried all of those, and some of them have worked, some of them haven't. And I found it very interesting that you see medicine also as a combination of those, even though medicine is a much older domain. I'm curious what you think about this identity struggle.
I mean, I think there are a lot of identity struggles for everybody, probably, but certainly in medicine, and to me, this was a process of personal development. I think. I mean, to begin with, when I was at school, I think I saw medicine as being a branch of science, and when I was at medical school, at university, that was the emphasis to begin with. I was at a traditional medical school where the first 3 years was learning stuff, but never seeing a patient, and so. For the first 3 years, that idea, there wasn't anything to disrupt that idea, because I was learning facts. I was learning. I mean, there were facts about people, and it included dissecting cadavers in the dissecting room to learn anatomy, and there were practical aspects, but it was really populating my mind, I think, with facts and categories and pigeonholes and scientific knowledge that I imagined at the time would be what I would use as an applied scientist whose domain was living people. Well, then I became a clinical student, studying on the wards with patients. And then I became more and more aware, I think, even at that stage, of aspects of the work that I hadn't anticipated. And some of those were external aspects, the sheer variety of people in general means that the sort of my schoolboy understanding of the scientific approach of developing and testing hypotheses, of gaining factual knowledge, which once gained was there forever and was static, and that scientific work consisted really of minimizing variables and focusing on one thing, finding out about it, learning it, fixing it, and going on to the next thing. It simply didn't fit with a world where every patient was completely different and you really couldn't control variables. And so I started sort of having to think in more than one way at the same time, I think, because of course that scientific knowledge was important. It's essential. You have to have it, and it takes a long time to develop, and it's arduous and often tedious, but it just has to be there. And the same also goes for the sort of component skills of clinical practice, and particularly as I went further on and specialised initially in surgery, there's a very strong emphasis, of course, on clinical skills. But always in the background was that there was that sense that there was more than one way of thinking about anything, and there was more than one solution to any problem, and that actually I was operating at a sort of nexus, really. And then I became even more aware of that in the later stages of my surgical career, where, to begin with, I saw it as the starting point being to absorb a canon of knowledge, let us say anatomical knowledge. And of course that too is essential, and you have to have that as a surgeon, well, any clinician really, but as a surgeon in a lot of detail. And I learnt that from textbooks, and I learnt that from dissecting cadavers and teaching medical students how to do that. But it wasn't until quite a bit later on that I recognized how big was the gulf between having a sort of a sense of canonical knowledge, which works very well up to a point, in that you know that pretty much always somebody's heart is going to be up in the left-hand side of their chest, more or less in the middle, and their liver is going to be on the right, and their spleen is going to be on the left. And that gives you essential landmarks. But what you also need to recognize, and that's what the books don't tell you, is that when you're operating on an individual person, there is a huge amount of individual variation. And that variation can be absolutely crucial. Because although a lot of it doesn't particularly matter surgically, there are some parts of the body, for example, where the precise arrangement of how an artery winds around a duct or something is critically important, because if you get that wrong, if you misinterpret what is there and you squeeze it into what you expect to be there, you can do very serious damage or even kill people. And so the stakes become very high. And so you have to recognize that what you are encountering has similarities with what you expect, but may be different. And the real world requires you to notice and observe and respond appropriately to what you find, rather than what you hope to find or what you expect to find. And I don't know if this has parallels in the computing world, although I imagine it probably must do. But it's particularly vivid in the world of trauma surgery, where, at that time, where this was in the 1980s, where there was nowhere near the level of detailed imaging, for example, that's available today. And also you're having to do things very quickly. People would come in often unconscious, often critically ill. I had to take them to the operating theatre within a few minutes, open up their chests, open up their tummies, deal with bleeding, whatever it was. No chance to get preliminary information. And so I really had to deal with what I found on the spot in the moment, then and there, and act fast. And that meant coming up abruptly against the difference between what I expected and what I found. And so that was surgery. And then in the next stage of my career, when I became a family doctor, I wasn't operating anymore. I was focusing much more on an element of practice that had, of course, been there in surgery, which is relationships with patients. But that was that was often overshadowed by the need to operate on people I hadn't met because they came in unconscious and critically ill, and that had to take priority. But as a GP, it was all about starting by trying to characterize the problem. It wasn't a case of just recognizing how and in what way to apply pre-existing solutions that I'd populated my internal filing cabinets with. But it was very often the task was to try and work out what the problem was that the patient had come with. And sometimes they didn't know what that was either. It might be vague. They hadn't been sorted out by somebody else into patients' problems that had a surgical solution. They could be anybody. And it could be a sort of overtly medical problem. They might have an infection or a cancer, and I needed to diagnose it and treat it. Or it might be that their child was being bullied at school, or they got into debt, or they had rats in the house, or it could be all sorts of things. And so the problem there was to identify the problem, or rather the challenge there was to identify the problem, rather than focus too much on solutions. And there again, I wondered if there might be parallels in the world of computing. So that's what made me think, in retrospect, that medicine was very much a practice that depends on science, it depends on skill, and it depends on communication and performance. But it is not wholly described by any of those. It is an intersection point between all of them.
Yeah, so there are many parallels to software development, and let's see, I'd like to pick on a few, because a few things that happen. So in software development, you usually have a customer who comes and say, I want an application for something, I don't know. It can be any kind of thing. If you work in a bank, it's probably going to be something around banking or financial systems. But you can also work in companies that create software for external customers, and those customers can be from typography domain or printing domain up to medicine or any kind of fields. And there's often this need to understand what the customer actually needs, but at the same time, one of the most difficult things is to understand what they really need and how you can actually help them. One of the things with software is that we often see it as kind of a magic thing, but in reality, it has to be extremely precise, and the level of precision in dialogue that you need to have, the level of precision that you need to get into is so high that it's very surprising to people outside the domain when they come and say, I want an application. Well, that's not enough. We have to define in very clear details what you want. And so one component to this is that we learn in university, very similar, like you said, we learn things about how computers work and how the tools that we use work and so on. But then we end up in a field where there is no clear answer to the problems. Some problems actually require experimentation. You need to go through different steps to try things out and so on. One thing I find interesting in the case of medicine is that there's a long practice of things. So when you are in the operating room and when you find something weird, and you fall back on a few practices, on things that you've trained on. And this is something that we miss in software development. Is that a correct impression, or am I just...
When you say fall back on things you've trained, are you talking about techniques and things?
Yes, on techniques.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so one of the... and that, I think that speaks to the sort of internal story that certainly I was aware of as I became more experienced as a surgeon. And I have to say that this is particularly the case in trauma surgery, which is what I was focusing on. So this was when I was working in Southern Africa, in big hospitals, where there were, in particular, I worked on the outskirts of Johannesburg in Soweto, which is a big township there, where there were extremely high levels of violence, and an awful lot of stab wounds. So patients would come in, often very critically ill, with a stab wound, and the knife had been taken out very often, and you would have no idea what you would find. So you'd open somebody up, and it might be their tummy or their chest, or even worse, their neck, where they're very complicated anatomical structures, and because there was injury, there would often be bleeding, and sometimes very dramatic bleeding, and that makes you want to react immediately to stop the bleeding. And the usual way of stopping the bleeding, this sounds obvious, but if an artery has been cut or something, you put a clip on it, a clamp on it, an instrument to stop the bleeding. So an instinctive response, or almost instinctive, is if you open something up and all of a sudden there's bleeding, you want to put a clamp on it. You ask for a clamp, you get it, you put it on. But if you put a clamp on indiscriminately in a part of the body where you can't see accurately what's happening because there's a pool of blood in the way, you are very likely to do damage. And so you have to separate your urge to be active and to solve a problem, and instead find a way of immediately reaching an interim solution, which is to stop things getting any worse while you have time to think what to do next. And in surgery, the answer is really to press hard, and we'll get somebody else to press hard on whatever is bleeding with a big swab of sort of linen pack. And if you do that, that will almost always, not absolutely always, but almost always give you time to. It provides you with a place of safety, where you can find out more about the situation than you knew before you started the operation, but not yet enough to plan exactly what to do next. And so there are sort of retraining yourself in terms of what you do in response to something that happens. It might be bleeding, it might be being unable to identify a structure, it might be having a problem with somebody else in your team, it might be what to do when the anaesthetist tells you that the patient's becoming sick in some other way. There are all sorts of things that could happen, but I think you learn ways, or at least I learned ways as I became more experienced of handling those things that were part of a multifaceted picture, which, if I over-focused on them, would make me make bad decisions. Mm. And so I think there was something about sort of learning to keep to keep together the different aspects of the situation that I was responsible for, and think beyond just finding out where that stab had gone and dealing with it. And that was particularly the case with these stab wounds, because it was very easy to fall into the trap that I know is well described in many domains, and I'm not sure if it works in your world as well, but in medicine there's a saying that the fracture that is most often missed is the one after the one that's been noticed first. And so when patients come in with injuries and they have x-rays, people looking at those x-rays, when they notice that there's a fracture of the rib or a fracture of the arm or something, they think that the job is finished there. And so they don't notice a small fracture in the spine or something like that because of attentional focus on one part of the picture. And I think there's something like that in these, in the kind of surgery I was doing, where you find that something has been injured and you can overlook other things, less conspicuous, but sometimes more important things that have also been injured. But because you're focusing on the first one or the most dramatic one you found, you can sometimes overlook others. So there's something about over-focusing and allowing your own anxiety or your own wish for closure, I mean, metaphorically as well as physically, or to bring things to an elegant conclusion, you can allow those to seduce you into missing things, I think. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? And I mean, I found this later on when I was a GP. Patients would come in and they'd say things like, I was thinking about that when you were talking about the banks. Patient would come in and say, I'd like some antibiotics, please. And so, you know, the temptation when you were very busy and there was lots of stuff is to say, okay, yeah, and write out a prescription for some antibiotics. But actually, the question was, why did somebody want antibiotics? And actually, they might have wanted antibiotics because they framed the problem as something that actually required a completely different approach. Mm. And so, as you were talking, I was thinking about that kind of thing in my experience, where somebody will come maybe asking for an app to do something, perhaps, but actually what you need to get at is why do they need that app and what do they want? What is the problem that they're trying to solve?
Precisely. Yeah. And also one thing that happens is that often customers underestimate the amount of work necessary to build their app, because it seems like it's something easy. In your mind, you say, yeah, it just needs to have a few screens and it will do. But then if you go in the appropriate level of detail, you realize that it's a 3 years long development or something like that, and they don't have the budget to do so because it's quite expensive to build applications and so on. And then there's a whole back and forth about figuring out what precisely is the problem that you're trying to solve and how can you find the minimum thing that actually solves your problem. And, but I like to, there's one theme in your book that I found very interesting, which is embodied knowledge, that you talk a lot about. That is this kind of knowledge that you, as an expert, you keep integrating into your body, and it develops in time. But most of the examples are about the material that you are working with, material things. And I'm wondering, you also wrote the book, you're also an author, so you obviously know what it means to be writing things. And coding is quite similar to writing. What about the embodied knowledge for things, virtual materials? You know, when you write, is there such a thing? Does it apply, or is there a difference?
I think it absolutely does apply. Yes, I mean, the writing is an interesting one because, I mean, obviously there is a physicality to writing at an obvious level. You know, you're writing with a pen or you're writing on a keyboard, and there's that sort of relationship between the ideas and the words that might be in your head and the way that they come out into a visible form, and how you and your relationship with them as they're doing that and once they've done it, and seeing things that you've written down, and then I think being able to engage differently with something once you've articulated it, once you've put it into words, and once those words are visible as opposed to audible. But I think there's something else which is and so there is that physicality, there is that change from struggling to form the letters of the alphabet when you're 3 or whatever it is, to that becoming invisible and you just being able to write. And for many people, and I was very fortunate in that I learned to touch type when I was when I was a teenager, and that meant that there is for me there is not that barrier in being able to put words out on a screen, because that has become automatic largely, although for a lot of people that is a barrier. But there's something more in terms of the sort of metaphorical sense of using language and using words as a plastic material. And so when I was writing the book, I was very much aware of, it made me think of an encounter I had a while ago with a portrait sculptor, a very distinguished portrait sculptor. He actually is the man who made the images of the Queen in UK, the Queen on the coins 20 years ago or whatever. It's been redone recently, I think, but you know, so very well known, very skilled. And he was demonstrating to me how he starts off making a portrait, and he said, well, you know, the person I'm doing it is in front of me, and I have a sort of an armature there, and then I whack on some lumps of clay, and I get the general sense of that person's shape of their head, and then I shape them a little bit, and I get the sense of the nose and the brow and the chin and how it is, and then I start to just move them and shape them, and then I begin to do things in a bit more detail, and then I shape them, and I get that feeling with writing, that I'm putting down ideas and I'm capturing them, and I've got them there, and they're wriggling, and they may be sentences or phrases or ideas or whatever, and then as time goes on, I kind of shape them with my thumb, and I change them a bit, and I roll them around on my tongue in my head, and I think, do they work? And so I'm then working with them almost as if they were a physical material, as if they were cloth or clay or the inside of somebody's whatever. It has a very strong physical parallel, I think, but it is provisional and plastic and fluid. And I wasn't expecting this, because I'd only ever written things, apart from textbook kind of things, I'd only ever written fairly short articles and essays and papers and things. And so putting this all together in a book with a long form narrative that I wanted to be coherent, that I wanted to be easier to read than it was to write, and I wanted to pay attention to the need to make it easy to read, without being oversimplified. But I wanted to try and minimize the barriers of language for people to understand the ideas I was trying to convey, and I found that took a very, very long time. But to me, it was an almost physical process of becoming familiar with the materials. It goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about doing time. Reading your materials, spending time with them, materiality, becoming familiar and able to shape and reshape language in a way that I think has strong parallels with the physical world. And I imagine it may have strong parallels with software and code and
yeah. So this is why I'm asking, because it's very close to, and let me try to describe a bit the experience of going through this step as a programmer, because the barrier to entry in programming is actually quite low. In medicine, you need to have a laboratory, you need to study on you need specific materials, you need specific tools and so on. But when you start as a programmer nowadays, it's just you need a computer, you need a text editor, and you need to download the programming languages, which is, most of them are available for free, and it's a lot of, and to learn something from, how to write code from YouTube or other places. Now, when I was started, we didn't have internet as much as we have today, and so but I was able to play with code, and code is fundamentally text. So you write text, but it text with very strict rules, because the computer needs to understand the text and to execute it. And so you kind of do your time by trying out various things, and often they don't work. Often you get very weird errors. At that point, the computers I was working on would even reset, and I would lose everything I did. And so this was kind of the experience that I had. But then you go into this place where you need to work in a team suddenly. So it's no longer you alone with a computer. But this is where we all start. And I think one of the challenges here is also that the computer does everything that you tell it to do. And that doesn't do very good to your abilities to interact with other people, because other people won't do what you tell them to do. and so you end up in this weird situation where you need to work inside of a team, And everybody has strong opinions, but nobody has like arguments that come like in medicine. We don't have, let's say, a very strong argument that to say this is the way you do it because so many people have done that before and so on. And to me, one of the things that has happened later is that when I realized that I wasn't writing code for myself, but I was writing code that other people should be able to read, first of all. And then the end result, the application goes to some users who are actually using it. And I think this is another challenge because we rarely have contact with our users. We are often shielded from the people that use our applications by various product managers and other people who take care of this side of it. And so I find a lot of parallels with the model that you describe, but I also find a lot of spaces where I think software development is not doing quite what it should be doing. So for example, this step of, if we just take the doing time, the software industry has needed a lot of programmers for 40 years or so, and ideally productive from day one. So you end up in this situation where you haven't necessarily done all your time, as you said, with a mentor or something. You barely know how to write some code that works from time to time, right? But you are put in that situation where you need to work in a team and you get some requirements and you are asked for an estimation and you have no idea how to estimate, and that's why people end up hating estimating how long things will take. And many things can go wrong and you don't actually master this part. And this looks like a very crucial step in the development of expertise from your book. And I'm not sure what we could do to make it better. I'd be curious.
I think it's a very interesting one, Alex. I mean, certainly there's something then, isn't there, about doing things that you don't feel you have the skills to do, but you've got to do them anyway. There's something about, and I mean, that's very scary. And certainly in my experience, well, I'm talking now about the 1980s, where it was actually much more common than it is now for people at a relatively early stage in their career to have very big responsibilities in terms of doing operations, particularly at night without senior support. And that's particularly the case in the kind of operations I was talking about, because you never knew what you were going to encounter. And so you could start off by doing something that seemed relatively straightforward, only to find that actually the problem was in some part of the body that you really weren't comfortable in, like dealing with the chest or the big blood vessels near the heart. Or you could find yourself somewhere you really wouldn't have chosen to be, but you're there, and you've got to do something about it. So there's something about choosing or ending up functioning in a domain where there is not only risk to whoever or whatever you're working with, but risk to you in terms of damage to yourself by damaging other people, if you like, or being responsible for bad things happening, and having to cope with that and not allowing it to demolish your confidence to the extent that you leave whatever field you're in or become completely unable to work, but equally not become cavalier and insensitive and just carry on anyway and not caring about any damage you might do. And it's a delicate line to tread, I think. And so there's something about how you navigate uncertain waters where you are aware that there are hazards around you. You try and do your best to sail safely, but there is always the knowledge that things may go wrong, and then the landscape will change very quickly. I think there's also, though, something about recognizing that whatever you do is never the only thing that could ever have been done, and that there are always options. I mean, certainly when I was a GP, I would often think in terms of provisionality. Somebody would come with a problem, we'd try and work out. I would say, well, it seems to me that what's most likely is it's this, and let's try this as a form of treatment. We'll try these drugs or something like that. And if I'm right, then in a week's time, it'll be a lot better, and you won't have had any side effects. But if I'm not right, we might need to change things. So try it out for a week, and let's meet again, and we'll have another conversation. But if in the meantime things get worse, then let me know, that kind of thing. And then and so it would be a series of sort of collaborative exchanges where we would try something out and see if it worked, and if it didn't, change it. And when I started talking to the bespoke tailor, who appears in the book, Joshua Byrne, something very similar happens there in his world, where he would come up with a design for a suit or jacket, and then over a series of encounters called fittings, it would become more and more, it would become closer and closer to what it would eventually be. It would start off as just the elements of a jacket, and then the next time there would be more bits to it, or bits would be finished. And in between those fittings, it would go away and be worked on by other tailors and then reassembled. And so that model of a sort of progressive series of episodes or encounters seemed to me to make a lot of sense in a lot of areas. I mean, I experienced it medically. I think I experienced it in my relationship with this book, where we would encounter one another every so often. I would put it on one side, had other things to do. I'd come back to it, print it out, read it. It would look different. I'd make adjustments. It would change, and my sort of sense of the world of software is that it's not just that you do all the design and that's it forever afterwards, but that it is also a series of provisional steps which get increasingly close to what you want, but possibly never ever get there. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yes. So one part of the history of software, actually, and I think where we got on the wrong track, is that we started with a model called the Waterfall Model, where the implication was that you could make the phases of development, design, implementation, testing, all of them separately, and then kind of get the whole thing working. And it took us, 20, 30 years to realize that doesn't work. It works in specific domains where the domain is very stable, where you have a lot of knowledge about the domain and so on. So there are specific parts where this model is valid. But today, there's a whole change in the industry, which is called agile software development, which is fundamentally what you say. It's let's build, if a customer comes to us, we say, okay, so we understand that this is what you want. Let's build this small step, small piece of it, show it to you, and then you'll tell us, okay, this is good or not, and then we can adjust and just continue meeting like this every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks and so on. So this is one part of software development, which is the user-facing part, the customer-facing part. Behind the scenes, however, there's a whole other thing. So imagine that when you are writing your book, instead of writing your book, you're writing something else, kind of your ideas, but they get compiled automatically into this book that people read. And those ideas that are behind, it's something that you need to be able to maintain over long periods of time, and not only yourself, but also with other people. This is more or less what programming is about. So there's a very visible part, which is the front, the things that we use, the thing that we see, all of them as users. But then where we face a lot of problems is actually the other side, where we realize after many, let's say many weeks or years, or that we've made some mistakes there that are very difficult to change, to fix. And so it's a lot like developing knowledge in time, but encoding it in a very specific manner.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So, I mean, when I was talking about my experiences at medical school, I think that was an interesting. Looking back on it was an interesting juxtaposition of different ways of looking at the world. So the medical school model was based on a sort of diagnosis, investigation, treatment model. So a patient comes in with something wrong with them, you talk to them, you find out what they're complaining about, you examine them physically, you do some tests, you get a differential diagnosis, a number of things it could possibly be, you choose, you see if you've got enough information to decide which one of those it is. If you haven't, then you go back and you do more tests, or you ask more questions, or you examine more, or you do more tests or more scans or more whatever it is, until you do find the answer. And once you found the answer, you know what the treatment is. There might be several options, but here are the things that affect which option you choose, and then you do it. And it is essentially, it sounds like your waterfall model, it's a linear path. Maybe recursive, you may have to go around it more than once, but essentially that's the process. And it requires you to have a whole lot of knowledge or access to ways of getting information at different points in the system. But it does not really admit of the possibility that there might not be a solution, or there might be things that lie outside its way of thinking. In the outside world, and that works quite well in many branches of medicine. I mean, all experienced practitioners know that it doesn't really work like that, but they, they are sufficiently skilled and experienced to do what needs to be done and to improvise and to think flexibly within that framework without challenging the framework itself. But when I became a family doctor, a GP, that model just didn't work, because people didn't come with what they should have done. They didn't come and they said, I've got this awful pain in the right side of my neck and I've had it for 4 days, and it gets worse when I eat a tangerine, and it gets better when I eat a banana, and it goes away completely when I lie down. They didn't do that. They said, I don't know what it is, doctor, but there's something that's just, I can't put my finger on it, but there's something that's just not quite right, and then burst into tears. Or so, and the textbooks didn't tell you about people who get a general feeling that something's not quite right, can't tell you what it is, but burst into tears. And so it doesn't fit within the framework, because the framework's different. And I thought that was very interesting. It took me a lot of time to get to reframe my own internal sort of way of thinking, and it took me a long time to think about how to help other people go through that stage as well. People who come out of a sort of one kind of medical training and into a different kind of experience, where in that first model, if you don't know something, it's seen as a failure or a sign of weakness or lack of hard work or something. Whereas in the second, not knowing something it's natural and expected, and it's just a question of finding out what it is that you don't know, and then finding out what you need to do to respond appropriately, and so that makes the universe of possibilities much wider, I think.
Yeah, and this is combined in software development with a problem that I believe we have, starting with education, because the fundamental education in university for programmers is and computer engineering and all these fields is we have this problem, and this problem has one solution, and you need to write the code that shows that solution, because it's one problem, one solution, and so on. And this is kind of what we are trained with in university, and then you end up in the field of software development, where often you don't know what the problem is first of all, but nobody has taught you to figure out the problems and to split it into smaller problems and to see which one to attack. And this is kind of one of the problems we often see with people that we work with in companies, and that it was a transformation for us as well to go to this point where we completely change our minds and think differently about this. And it sounds quite similar, right?
Yes. And the other thing that it made me think of when we were talking was what I mentioned in the book, the work by a man called David Pye, who was a furniture designer in the 1960s, who talked about the workmanship of risk and the workmanship of certainty. And I thought that was interesting. He was talking about, he's not talking about risk in the sense of bad things going wrong. He was talking about risk in the sense that things that you make yourself are never exactly the same on two occasions. And there is always uncertainty about exactly what the final product will look like. Whereas if you're designing something that is going to be made on a production line, then apart from mechanical failures or something, if it's a water jug or I don't know, a fountain pen, or whatever it is, once you've done all the design thinking and then you pull the handle that starts the machine working, then each one that comes out at the end will be exactly the same. And that he calls the workmanship of certainty. Workmanship of risk he talks about as things that are newly made each time. And it seems to me that that there is a danger of confusing those two or conflating those two. And that there are times, of course, I mean, I imagine in the computing world, if something works well, you want it to do something, the same thing every time. You don't want people sort of redesigning it every time it does it, but you want it to do the same process again and again very quickly and reliably. But that's different from the workmanship of risk, which would involve designing things differently on different, for different purposes. And I think that distinction is an interesting one, because risk doesn't necessarily mean bad things. It just means different things.
Yes, one of the challenges, additional challenges, I think, in software is that for every problem that comes, you have an almost infinite numbers of ways in which you can write the code. And I think you can relate to that in your with writing, because you can write a book in innumerable numbers of ways, right? You can have more stories or less stories, or more personal experiences, or more scientific, or more. So it's a very similar place there, and I think one of the challenges is that to find kind of that wisdom to figure out which is the solution that fits this context, this problem, this technology, these constraints in terms of costs and whatever else you need to do. And this is one of the problems that is not, let's say, fully solved in software. I mean, we talk about finding the simplest solutions and trying to simplify things and writing things as easy as possible for other people to understand, and using language that is from the domain that we are working in and not technical domain. And these are a few ideas, but it's not yet quite, it's not something that's easy to figure out. It sounds more like the wisdom that you talk about for expertise.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and it's also, there's something about, again, going back to it's not about you, it's about them. And I found this with writing, I was trying to think as much as I could how this would land with somebody who did not themselves have any particular insider knowledge of any of the worlds I was describing, but who would be able to make connections from their own experience. And so that was trying to, I mean, I set out to go through what I'd written time and again, trying to squeeze it and get rid of needless words and unnecessary adjectives, and try and simplify it as much as I could, but not too far. And again, there were an infinite number of possible ways of doing that, of course, but sooner or later you have to you have to declare for something, don't you? You have to make a choice and stick with it, because in this case, sooner or later, by a certain date, I had to send off to the publisher a manuscript, and it had to stop somewhere. And so I had to make a judgment, I suppose, about trying to put myself in a reader's position. And I mean, I had help there because I was working with an editor called Jack Ram at Penguin, who then became independent but continued as my editor. And that was a very useful place. I'm not sure if you have that parallel in the world of software design, but in this case, this was somebody who was able to work with me and bring an outsider's perspective and make very helpful suggestions about sequencing and balance and reining in my sort of wish to put in stories of all these thousands of experts I'd worked with, and say, no, actually it's getting confusing now, just choose one or two and stick, that kind of thing, helping me shape decisions about scope and range and balance.
Yeah, and we have something similar in software development, but it's a practice that's not adopted as much, which is pair programming. So fundamentally, programming when you start is alone. You're alone with the computer, you write text, computer responds, does what you want or gives you an error message, or does something weird, and then you need to investigate a bit. So it's quite difficult at some point to switch to this model where you actually work with somebody near you, and you write the code together, and you look at the problems together, and you discuss the options for how to phrase fundamentally what you're writing.
Well, this was a bit like that, but I mean, it wasn't co-authorship.
Yeah,
it was these two different roles.
Yeah.
And I thought that was particularly interesting because they were distinct roles with different functions, but I think they were both. Well, I mean, I'm sure people do write books without that kind of. I know many people write books without that kind of support, and I was very fortunate in having it. But it was about hearing different voices. I think I had another very interesting experience. I'm not sure if there's any parallel with your world here, which was at the end. My Jack Ram, my editor, said that on a previous occasion he'd spent some time with another author reading through the book, reading it aloud, and so he suggested that he agreed to. He spent 3 days, 3 very long, arduous days in my house actually, and we sat in a room, and I'd printed out the manuscript, and I read it aloud, and he sat there with the same manuscript on his computer, and we agreed that when either of us or both of us thought a change needed to be made, he would then put that onto the version on the computer so that we had the final version at the end. And that was very interesting because the words that I'd written on the page sounded very different when I read them and when we heard them. And things that sounded fine on the page limped or were spiky or they just didn't work sometimes when read aloud. And so that different mode of engaging with the content was very interesting. I can't imagine you, well, maybe you do in the software world, but by changing one aspect of it, in this case, how the words came to our attention through sound rather than vision, changed our relationship with them, and we had different comments, and so there was negotiation and there was discussion about it, but it prompted it enabled a different kind of conversation about it. And so I wondered if there was anything about changing the mode that you use to engage with what you've created.
Yes, I mean there are a few things. There were some experiments with reading code out loud, but I can say they caught on. It's very long.
No, I wasn't meaning that you would do exactly that, but I just wondered if there were other things. things. I don't know, expressing code musically or in some other way. I don't know.
That would actually be fun. No, I think one thing that we realized about 20 years ago, but it's not yet against a technique that's used by a lot of people, is code has very many similarities with text, but it also has one very strong particularity, which is it's executable. So it's not only something that you write and you look at it and it's static, you can also interact with it. And there are ways of interacting with it, of course, as a user, but there are also ways of interacting with it as a programmer, because as a programmer, you can fundamentally call random pieces of code and kind of play with how they act. And there's one particular practice around this, which is called test-driven development, where we start by writing a small piece of code that defines what we want to implement. And that piece of code, first of all, when you run it, it gives you a red flag. It says that it doesn't work, of course, because you haven't implemented anything yet. And then you write the corresponding thing that implements the feature. And then you go into a cycle like that. And this builds upon this interactivity that you can always have. It's almost like a dance with the system, a dance with the problem. In a way that allows you to emerge a solution that you haven't particularly expected in the beginning. But there are a few reasons why it's hard to adopt. One of them is that we are taught that there's one problem, one solution, and that you should find a solution for the problem. And it's kind of an ego-based thing to find a nicer solution for the problem just by looking at it. Although it's often not possible. It doesn't work like that. And the second one is, in order to do that practice, you need to take a problem and split it into smaller and smaller problems and kind of build upon that. So this is, I think, the most we can do. I mean, there are some experiments with visualization of the code in various ways, instead of looking at text, looking at diagrams and so on, but they didn't quite work. This is the closest one that we have, but it's still difficult to adopt by many people. So let me ask you, we are getting close to the end, and I have one question that I'd like to ask you, because I think one particular thing in software which is different than what I understand from domains like medicine or, I don't know, aviation or even something like tailoring, which have been around for a long time, is that the knowledge about the practices and the tools that we use is very local and unevenly distributed. So if you go to one organization, they will tell you a set of tools, a set of things that they do. If you go to another, you'll get a completely different set of tools. And often these organizations, I mean, it's okay if they are very different. Like, it's very different to write code for a plane or a X-ray machine. It's very different to write a web application that does, I don't know, an e-shop or something like that. There are different stakes there and completely different rules for those. But often these apply to the same kind of fields. And I'm wondering if this, and I think everybody in this industry is wondering, is this a factor that depends on the youth of in the industry, or is this a symptom of something else? And I'm not sure if you have something around this.
So let me see if I've understood this correctly. So you're saying it's whether it's specific, is that right, and limited to one particular area, or are you talking about how the world of code can be applied in different ways to different areas of practice?
So
with these different and things, or
so what I mean is that if you go to two companies that are building, let's say, e-shops, I don't know, Amazon and another similar company, you'll find very different ways of working, very different practices, very different ways of writing code. And this is, even if they use the same technologies, even if they use, so that's what I mean, that these things are very localized. So it seems like
So have things settled down? You mean in other areas that have been around for centuries? Has that become sort of condensed until there is just one way of doing things? It's a very interesting one. There are certainly examples where it hasn't. The tailor I've worked with is a very interesting example, I think, of practicing in a different way from most other tailors, because most tailors, bespoke meaning, as I now understand it, creating something that has, well, for most tailoring houses, most tailoring organizations, bespoke means somebody comes into the shop and they want something that fits them perfectly in the cloth that they've chosen. And so what happens is you go to a place like that and they will make you exactly that in a style that they have already designed. And it will be made for you in your size, and you'll choose the textile, but it will be their design, and that will be a design usually that has been handed down for generations. It's called a block. And so there is that design which has a two-dimensional paper representation like a plan for a building, and it will be modified by the tailors to fit you, but there will be very little in the way of originality in it. Joshua, the tailor I've been working with, has a complete, and very often those tailors will not understand the principles, or not fully understand the principles on which those blocks have been made. They are working with what they inherited, and they are applying it. Whereas Joshua, as he explained it to me, in the course of his two apprenticeships, and inspired by one particular very unusual mentor, learnt from first principles how to construct every aspect of every garment he is called upon to make. So when he starts with a customer, he's not saying, what material do you want me to make our suit in for you? But he's trying to work out what that person wants a suit to do. What is the problem that they are setting out collaboratively to address? And it might be a bit like me with the patient who comes in and wanting antibiotics, that actually what the person wants is a suit that will make them feel confident in a competitive environment, or that will feel very comfortable in the Far East, or will do whatever it might happen to be. And so once he has established the nature of the problem, and once he's made observations about what that patient looks like, how they move, all the rest of it, he's then able to almost improvise, in the sense of drawing on all his knowledge and skills to come up with a solution for that person in that moment. And I think that's interesting, because it's an unusual way of doing things, partly because it's very time-consuming and effort-consuming, and it doesn't fit with a lot of business models of wanting to, use product and sell lots of things. But I think there's also a philosophical difference, because it requires a comfort with uncertainty and the willingness always to be doing something that hasn't been done before, that I think only suits some people. And I think that there is that way of working in many areas that you look at, but when they've been around for a very long time, they've come up collectively with ways that make that not necessary, where you can do things as they are already done. And there's some very interesting work, I think, about routine and adaptive expertise. I'm not sure if you've come across that by particularly Berreiter and Scott Amelia. They talk about routine expertise is being able to do the same thing again and again, very, very sort of effectively, very efficiently. Adaptive expertise is and they give the example of you're learning to drive, and routine expertise is when you've internalized all these processes of using the controls and dealing with traffic and things. And most people, when they get good at that, it frees up attentional capacity. And most people use that freed up attentional capacity to listen to the radio or talk to their passenger. The people who want to develop their skills as a driver, however, they redirect that freed up attentional capacity to keep putting themselves at the edges of what they are comfortable with doing, and to set themselves new challenges. And so they are learning to drive at high speed in the fog on motorways, or they're going on skid pans, or they're constantly putting themselves out in uncomfortable positions. Now, of course, there are big benefits in the routine expertise, because that allows you to do things that need to be done again and again and again in a consistent way, but they don't equip you to respond quickly and effectively to the unexpected, partly because you blank out the unexpected and you don't even notice it. Or if it does happen, you haven't got that way of thinking at your disposal. Now, of course, you don't want to be an adaptive expert. You don't want to be coming up with a completely new solution to every problem, even if it's the same problem as the last one. So you need to get a balance. But I think that a lot of organizations and a lot of centuries-old ways of doing things have sort of tended towards the routine expertise model and taken people away from the adaptive one.
Yeah, that makes sense. And
maybe as a young area, maybe there's much more of the sort of newly minted adaptive kind of working out what to do while it's still in the air kind of approach, or maybe there was in the early days, and maybe you're going through a transition. I don't know.
Yes, I mean, one of the known problems in software development is the syndrome that we call not invented here, where a developer would pick a problem that has already been solved many times, and you often have an off-the-shelf solution that you can pick, and they start implementing their own solution because it was not invented here. So, all right, this has been extremely interesting. So thank you a lot for this. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience before we close? Something that perhaps we haven't talked about?
No, I mean, on another occasion, perhaps we can talk about the impact of getting things wrong, and dealing with the consequences of that, and that idea of always knowing that there are other ways you could have done things, and how you come to terms with the fact that the solutions you come up with are never final. They're always provisional, and there are always other ways you could have done things or could do things. And when you try those out, things may well go wrong, but that is not in itself a reason for not having done them. That is simply how you continue developing. And that idea, I suppose, that I've mentioned in my book of this path to becoming expert as being one that it's easier to see where it's come from than where it's going. I mean, it's not always easy to tell where it started, because obviously it starts where we're all born and developing those skills and things we develop as in childhood. But all the experts I've talked to, who I think really are expert, say something similar, which is that they recognise that they've come a long way, but they've never got anywhere near where they could get to, because it's a path that doesn't have an end. And they are always striving for something that they know is unattainable, but is still worth striving for.
Yes, and I think many programmers recognize that, because often when we look at our code written 6 months ago or 1 year ago, we look at that and think, how could I be so stupid to write that code? It's often that feeling, and it's often a frustration in the in our minds, because we also strive for perfection mostly through the nature of because working with computer means that you need to be very precise. So I think we are closer to striving for an unattainable perfection, which often doesn't exist, in fact. Um, so where can people find you on the internet?
They can find me on the internet on my personal page at Imperial College London, the university where I work, one of the big London universities. And so if you just put in Imperial College London and Kneebone, my surname Kneebone, your search engine will find that. You can find lots of conversations I've been having for a number of years now in a podcast series I host called Countercurrent, all one word, Countercurrent. And if you put Countercurrent and my surname Kneebone into your search engine, that will come up with the link there. And that might interest people because those are conversations, with similarities to this one, with interesting people exploring ideas where we don't know where the conversation is going to go, with over 140 people now from a wide range of areas, from the visual and the performing arts, medicine, science, philosophy, mathematics, all sorts of areas. And so do have a look at that. And of course, my book itself, which I think you've given people the details of, but it's called Expert: Understanding the Path to Mastery, and it's published by Penguin. And again, that's on the Penguin website and available from bookshops and online, of course. And if anyone wants to contact me directly, I'd be very happy. My email is r.kneebone, Kneebone, @imperial.ac.uk.
All right. Thank you very much for your time. Once again, this has been a very interesting conversation, and I feel like we could go on for 6 hours more. But
I feel like that, and maybe on another occasion we should. But for the time being, thank you very much for inviting me to take part.
All right. So before we close, we have to pay our dues to the YouTube algorithm. So please, if you enjoyed this conversation, like, share, subscribe. Put down a comment if you would like us to have more conversation, maybe ask your own questions. I think it's a great opportunity to explore more in what it means to be an expert in software development, just something I feel like we still need to work on, so we can learn more about this together. And I'd like to thank you all for watching, listening, and until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart.